Baker Botts, LLP, provides podcasts for educational purposes only. They are not legal advice and are not intended to establish an attorney client relationship. This communication may constitute attorney advertising. Welcome to AI Council Code. The AI Council Code is here to keep you up to date on all AI legal issues arriving in the modern business frontier. I'm Maggie Welsh. I'm a partner at Baker Botts, and I co-chair the AI practice team. Today, we're going to be talking about a hot topic in AI and one that everyone is really talking about, privacy. So today, we're joined by Nick Palmieri and Elizabeth Rogers. They're attorneys in our New York office at Baker Botts. Elizabeth and Nick, thanks for joining us today. And why don't you both introduce yourselves?
Yeah, thanks, Maggie. I'm Nick Palmieri. As Maggie said, I'm a mid-level associate in the intellectual property group here at Baker Botts in our New York office. I primarily practice in the patent space, both on patent litigation and patent prosecution. But in addition, I am also part of the firm's data privacy and cybersecurity practice group. And as a part of that work, I do a lot of work on data privacy issues, including modifying privacy policies, data breach response work, and things like that.
Great. Thanks, Nick, for joining us today. And Elizabeth, why don't you introduce yourself?
Hello. As you said, I'm Elizabeth Rogers. I am an attorney in the corporate group of our New York office. I am also a member of the firm's data privacy and cybersecurity practice group. I work primarily in more transactional corporate side, supporting M&A deals, corporate governance work related to privacy, cybersecurity, and AI. And I also do general corporate work focused mostly on securities.
Great. Thank you both for being here on the podcast today. So one concern I know that a lot of counsel have with respect to AI is privacy. But I'd like for you to break down for our listeners today really what those concerns are and what listeners should be looking out for when we're talking about AI and privacy. So Nick, why don't we start off with you? What are some of the high-level privacy issues with respect to AI that counsel and companies should be thinking about with respect to AI models?
What I see a lot of people looking at and being concerned with right now, and pretty rightfully so, is really the issue of what does an AI model actually do with the data that it has collected and the data that's otherwise input into the model. As I'm sure you know, AI models are trained on a lot of data and ingest a lot of data. So there's a concern of what the model is actually doing with that data and what rights does the actual AI modeler have in the data it's collected, whether that's confidential data or public data, as well as the rights of the person whose data it is actually using.
Great. Yeah, I think that is a big concern for a lot of companies when you're adding data into a model, especially confidential or customer data, sort of what happens to that data, where does it go, and who owns it after it's inputted into that model. And so one way that we are seeing companies address this issue is by crafting AI use policies prohibiting confidential data from being inputted into AI systems, into public AI systems. But it's also a concern with the private and customized models as well. And there seems to be somewhat of a question for when you're contracting with your AI service providers, making sure that there are clear confidentiality clauses in those contracts and that they're maintaining your confidential information and having security over your confidential information and customer data. So Elizabeth, turning to you, what do you see as a concern when it comes to AI and privacy?
Thanks, Maggie. One thing we're watching closely is data privacy regulation and how that's changing and evolving at state, federal, and international level. With some of the evolving nature of the laws, it raises the question of whether some of the models will be grandfathered in, or will the AI model need to be updated and changed to comply with evolving data privacy regulation, some of which has yet to come out. Additional data privacy regulation could mean that data is more restricted, meaning certain data sets that companies may plan to use to train an AI model will no longer be allowed for the training model. Instances such as when these models have been trained off of what was perceived as publicly available data with crawlers that have scoured the internet but As we've seen, some of those crawlers have been picking up what is considered under certain regimes to be personally identifiable information and otherwise regulated data, including copyrighted or otherwise protected intellectual property. As an offshoot of that consideration, on the more commercial side, is that access to those data sets is going to become more restricted. As things get more restricted, those who already have lawful access to that data are going to have an even greater competitive advantage than they otherwise would have had.
Interesting. Thanks, Liz. So there's data sets that have been obtained that may not be considered lawful in the future. Is that what you're suggesting?
It's entirely possible. We've seen instances where it's been reported that those types of data sets that were collected using internet crawlers that didn't necessarily distinguish between certain types of data have pulled what might be considered protected, personally identifiable information and even health data. And under certain regulatory regimes, those are protected. And if the person did not give explicit consent for their use for this specific purpose, and that's another nuance to a lot of data privacy, is that there's a purpose restriction. So when you give consent for the use of your personal information, you're giving consent for that company, entity, etc., to use it for a specific purpose, and they are not permitted to use that information for a different purpose.
So it sounds like the existing guidelines and practices do contemplate this generative AI and AI privacy considerations. Is that right?
Yes and no. In a lot of instances, existing privacy regulation does already touch on AI, like you said. For example, existing privacy regulation might touch on AI in the form of opt-out or opt-in rights. These refer to when consumers have the right to opt out of having their data processed for the purpose of automated decision-making. And this is where most of us interact with AI on a day-to-day basis. You encounter this when you click onto a company's website and you receive a prompt asking if you consent to use of certain cookies or use of your data in a certain way. We see this in existing state data privacy regulation.
Interesting point, Liz, and thanks for mentioning the state privacy regulation. So, Nick, what are we seeing from the states in terms of data privacy?
In the states, it's really quite a patchwork that's going on. Liz mentioned there are state regulations on data privacy specifically, and she's absolutely right. California kind of led the charge a few years ago with CCPA and the CPRA, which are California's consumer protection acts relating to data privacy. And a lot of states have started following along. We expect that's only increased so far. States like Virginia, Oregon, Colorado, several others have what we call comprehensive data privacy laws on the books. So those are laws in which data privacy is kind of tackled very broadly and refers to all kinds of protections of all users' data, as opposed to the sectoral approach that has kind of been the standard in the United States so far. So at the federal level, we don't have anything comprehensive. We have different laws that apply to different sectors: children, financial information, banking information, those kinds of things. Health information, HIPAA is a very well-known one that tackle particular sectors but don't cover data privacy as a whole. There are, as Liz mentioned, implications for AI in all of those, in how you collect the data, what you can do. But from an AI perspective, beyond the general applicability of those laws, they usually do not tackle AI specifically. So it's a very limited set of regulations in the US, I should say, right now for AI. We have a few things. President Biden last year released an executive order, and we just got sort of a confirmation that the expected or requirements have kind of been moving forward for that. And some states address things like automated decision making, which would implicate AI. But right now, there's really nothing comprehensive within the US that is tackling just AI. It's kind of this patchwork of whether or not a particular privacy law will apply. Do we need to comply? Things like that. In contrast, the EU has recently, and there's lots of news about it, has the EU's AI Act, which is going to be a more comprehensive set of regulations that deal with AI specifically. That act is set to tie in with Europe's data protection regulation, the GDPR, which went into effect back in 2018 and which kind of set off the race for data privacy. in the US, what I suspect to happen is California will likely lead the charge on AI regulation, at least. I shouldn't say that everyone's working on AI, but from a regulatory standpoint, California is likely to lead the charge as it has done for data privacy in the past, and then other states and maybe the federal government will likely follow along after that.
Great, thanks, Nick. And that's an interesting point you raised about the EU AI Act. It seems like that is the model to follow and the model that companies and countries will also be looking at when they think about their data privacy with respect to AI.
Jumping off of that, I'd just add that the EU AI Act, and Nick already touched on this, but it's probably going to be the model that governments will look to when considering AI regulation, similarly to how the GDPR set the tone for data privacy regulation. And GDPR being the comprehensive privacy regime across the EU, and now also the UK has, post-Brexit, its own version of GDPR, which I'll note the UK is currently considering reforms too that are making their way through Parliament, and we expect to see movement on those this year. But going back to the EU AI Act, it's taking a lot of its principal cues from data privacy frameworks, ideas of notice and access, transparency. A lot of them are built off of foundational pillars of privacy, such as fair information practices, and have elements such as reporting requirements, data access, record keeping, reporting, breach reporting requirements. So there's definitely going to be some overlap with data privacy regulation, and probably AI regulation is going to have some inconsistencies between jurisdictions, similarly to how we see in GDPR. For those who don't know, GDPR is enforced by the local data protection authorities across EU member states.
Interesting. So it sounds like the EU AI Act is something that all companies would be prudent to follow and to watch out for. Liz, at a federal level in the US, I know the FTC has been quite involved and recently had the settlement consent order with Rite Aid. Could you talk a little bit about that? What is the FTC trying to do in terms of regulating data privacy in the AI space?
Yes, the FTC has been quite active in this space. As you said, there's recently been that consequential consent order with Rite Aid, and that was related to their use of AI in a biometric facial recognition theft deterrent system. And that related to bias in the system, both in how it was deployed and how it was enforced. The FTC consent order gave very specific requirements for Rite Aid if they would wish to implement a similar AI biometric system going forward. And actually, I'll focus on that for a minute because this is one of those areas where that consent order is only going to be binding on the specific company. One of the key commissioners named in that consent order, Commissioner Bedoya, in a press release, remarked that the types of restrictions and governance considerations included in the consent order are what they're going to consider to be best practices and really baseline governance standards going forward. So anyone who's looking to get a sense of where the FTC's mind is as far as AI corporate governance is concerned and AI best use practices, be very well served in reading through that consent order and probably even using it as a template for their own internal governance standards.
I think that's an excellent point, Liz, that the consent order does have prescriptive best practices that it's seeking from companies to look at with their AI service providers, such as verification and transparency and making sure that you do know what is in your AI model and how your AI model is being used. So, Nick, in terms of federal legislation in the US, what are you seeing? Do you think that that's possible in the future?
It's certainly possible, given the pace at which they've tackled data privacy issues on a federal scale. I think it might be a while before we see anything, but I think what we're seeing is this buildup of momentum to at least do something or try to take proactive steps on it. We have every week or more hearings before Congress addressing AI, addressing how it applies to intellectual property. So we're definitely starting to see more actions from Congress on this issue. And then to Liz's point, we are seeing regulatory agencies take action. So even though there's not explicit litigation on the books, we see agencies like the FTC coming in using their plenary authority to execute these consent orders, otherwise protect people's privacy, and to kind of take a little bit reactive step to the use of AI by these companies. And that's pretty consistent with what we saw with data privacy too. The FTC kind of took the charge, used the authority they had and said, well, listen, data privacy is a consumer concern, and justified their investigations on a data privacy front in that way. And I think we're going to certainly see more of that as AI becomes more prevalent throughout, likely long before we see any federal laws on the topic.
Interesting. So what would you say to companies now in terms of data privacy? How should they be thinking about data privacy with respect to AI?
I think the most important step right now, and this is an important step at all times, but especially if you're plugging this information into some AI model, is understanding what data your company is collecting and what you're using that data for. AI is kind of a buzzword right now. Everyone wants to have their own AI or use AI for something, but what companies really need to be mindful of is what data they are putting into that model and whether they have properly collected that model and are using that data within the confines of what they collected it for. There are already limits on that kind of stuff. You have to tell people what you're collecting, what you're using it for. When it comes to AI, it's, again, once you're putting in that black box, it's a little bit fuzzy what is happening in there. So it becomes much harder to track. It becomes harder to figure out what exactly is going on, which makes the initial step of knowing why you collected this data, making sure people know why you collected this data, all of the more important. Really, from a practical perspective, what's going to help you is just constantly asking the question, what are we doing with this data? Do we actually need this data?
I think that's such an important point and something that we've heard from a number of our guests on the podcast already, that really thinking through the use case of AI is really important and really necessary to determining your risks and legal issues with respect to AI models. So, Liz, what are some things that you would recommend companies watch for with respect to data privacy and AI?
Thanks, Maggie. Like Nick already went over, it's really important to understand what purpose you collected the data for, what data you have, and branching off of that, I'd also point to where did you get the data from? All of it's interrelated, and while this isn't necessarily on the privacy regulatory side, I'd pivot a little bit to cybersecurity elements. We're already seeing how AI is not invulnerable to threat actors and cybersecurity attacks. Recently, the National Institute of Standards and Technology published a paper on the subject discussing the types of attacks that AI users and developers might expect to see. These are things like poisoning attacks, where corrupted data is input at the training phase, or abuse attacks, where a threat actor might determine what legitimate source a model is pulling their data from and then compromising that source. And those types of attacks and harms are really hard to undo on the back end. Similarly to once you've started using data for a specific purpose or use it in a model, it's hard to unbake the cake. Understanding those types of threats and how you can safeguard against and mitigate risks is going to be incredibly important going forward. I believe that will necessitate a lot of communication between departments within organizations involving software development, product, and legal at all stages of development, so that you can, to the degree possible, future-proof your models and your products and your use cases.
Excellent. Thank you, Liz, for that point. And as all companies become data companies and start using AI, it is going to be really important that companies think about safeguarding their data and thinking about those cybersecurity risks. I think that's another topic for another podcast that we'd love to have you and others at BakerBots come back on and talk about. So thank you both very much for joining us today and talking about this important issue of data privacy and AI. Thank you all for listening to the AI Council Code. We're glad that you joined us today, and stay tuned for additional podcasts and more insight on AI legal issues.
Thank you for listening to this BakerBots podcast. BakerBots has the experience, knowledge, and people to address our clients' most significant legal issues. For more information on BakerBot's practices, please visit us at bakerbots.com. This presentation is provided by BakerBots LLP for educational and informational purposes only. It is not legal advice and is not intended to establish an attorney-client relationship. Under the rules of certain jurisdictions, this communication may constitute attorney advertising.